How I evolved as an anthropologist is in large part because of my formation here, obviously, at Harvard in medical anthropology. That is, as we know, between social medicine and anthropology. A very long history to this. The infusion of intellectual inquiry with what, in Arthur's word, what is at stake, what's at stake, created an expansive vision and responsiveness to suffering that I think no other program, and I'm serious, that no other program in medical anthropology has achieved. So this has to be underlined. So I hope that my talk adequately expresses my gratitude, really, for the incredible labor, which I don't think I really understood as a graduate student. Sorry to say, but expresses my gratitude for the incredible labor that has gone into sustaining this intellectual vision and ethical commitment. So let me just begin. So in this talk, I bring us into the making of a neighborhood conflict in a low-income neighborhood in Santiago, Chile, under police occupation, a neighborhood that I will call El Hilo. I do so by bringing us into a series of household events involving the catastrophic injury of a 15-year-old boy from gun violence. The boy, whom I will call Charlie, was left quadriplegic after a gunshot injury sustained while he was walking with a friend down a neighborhood street. I met his mother, Celia, about 1 month after Charlie had come home from the hospital. She lived with her husband, Manuel, who at the time had just been released from prison, as well as her 12-year-old daughter, Nicole, and off and on with her eldest son, Ricky, his girlfriend, and their toddler daughter. As we will see, the straightforward account of the household that I just offered eclipses the ways in which the household is very much entangled with the neighborhood and state institutions, involving forms of talk, concrete practices of care, drug raids, police rounds, and documents. That is, the way that residues of prison and the dispersal of policing within the social body of the neighborhood take on life within intimate relations means that boundaries of the household here cannot be defined in advance. The talk today focuses specifically on the ways in which incarceration and policing is experienced as a normal feature of everyday life, such that neighborhood, prison, and police are experienced as modalities of the domestic. What are the tools and relays by which a dispersed policing apparatus is implicated in the making of neighborhood conflicts, even as it absents itself from the story of such conflicts? How does incarceration and this dispersed policing render the context itself as precarious, such that it is always at risk of slipping away? And how does this precariousness of context texture care in spaces of intimacy? This talk draws from a larger book project, which Scott had mentioned, in which I attempt to listen to the echoes of a death of a young man in El Hilo, whom I call Camilo, as his death reverberates through intimate kinship, neighborhood, and municipal and state institutions. Let me briefly give an overview of this book manuscript, which hopefully will go in under review at the end of January, because it gives a bit of context for this talk. Chapter 1 asks, what is an adequate description of loss? Accompanying Camilo's mother, Martita, this chapter traces the intimacies lost by the death of her son, where loss is not only expressed within the vocabulary of genealogical kinship, but such as the mourning, a mother mourning the loss of her son, but the loss of a whole way of being in the world. Chapter 2 attends to how the status of victim permeates kinship relations marked by violent death, in a context where the violent death of young men have no ready-made place within the language of victimhood or heroism. How does a genealogy of the victim of political crime and the boundary of the political dissident and common criminal permeate the creation of kinship relations in this context, and this is what I presented in March for the Friday morning seminar. Chapter 3, from which this talk draws, repositions the study of police and narco as household events and foregrounds women's perspectives, which are blocked out in the social science literature due to its overwhelming privileging of the perspective and figure of the male gang member and his associational networks. Finally, chapter 4 traces how municipal offices and a neighborhood group mobilize the notion of violent crime to remake Camilo's death into a legal case against the state. In doing so, it sheds light on the difficulties of human rights discourse in Chile today in recognizing the violence of state disordering in the form of drug raids and incarceration on the urban poor. So this is the first part. Where is the prison? Let me begin by how I arrived in El Hilo. The year was 2012. I was brought to El Hilo by my close friend Ruby, whose words and life story appear in my first book, Life in Debt, and who lives in La Pincoya, the low-income neighborhood where my research for Life in Debt was based. At that time, Ruby was working for an NGO that administered emergency work employment programs for women in low-income neighborhoods. As I accompanied Ruby, I started to see the physical dangers that her job entailed and questioned why she, the lowest paid among the NGO's staff, but with possibly the largest family to support, had been sent to walk up and down the streets to surveil women's work in a neighborhood where crossfire was a daily occurrence. Yet the women, having grown close to Ruby, enabled her work in what I can only describe as a network of embraces in which I too became enmeshed. Women hooked arms with Ruby, accompanying her to the next employment site, a school, to the next a church, to the next a community center. Along the way, stepping quickly into a neighbor's house when gunfire broke out or a drug raid was underway, crouching low and getting flat on the floors, quickly entering the back of a house when gunfire erupted within narrow passageways, using cell phones to call ahead to see if things were still intense or rígido or calming down. The women in the programs introduced me to other women, comprising 30 households in total, and through them I met Martita, her intimate kin and extended kin. I spent 9 continuous months accompanying Martita and her kin and visiting the 30 households in 2012, followed by shorter visits in 2013 and 2014. By this time, El Hilo had been under police occupation for several years on the premise that it was a barrio crítico, a critical neighborhood seen in the eyes of the state as a site for the illicit drug economy. In 2001, the Chilean Ministry of the Interior enacted a policing scheme called Barrio Seguro, or Secure Neighborhood, that focalized intensive policing to sections of poblaciones understood to be sites of drug trafficking and delinquency. In El Hilo, police surveillance is carried out not only via identity checkpoints by carabineros, these are street police run by military justice, and rounds by the Special Operation Group, armored vehicles, again, also by military justice, but also by making kin and neighbors into temporary informants, creating profound insecurity and suspicion over everyday talk and banter. This pervasive surveillance residing within intimate kinship and neighborhood is intensified by massive drug raids conducted by civilian police investigations, anti-narcotics brigade, that bring whole passageways and kinship relations into a police dragnet aimed to root out illicit associations trafficking in drugs. This policing scheme drew heavily from broken windows policing, developed in the United States. As is well known, the broken windows approach is premised on the idea that small disorders causally lead to crime and places what had been previously just understood as nuisances, right, within a theory of thick propensities, such that those who engage in such nuisances, now understood as disorder, right, reveal a propensity to commit crime and should therefore be punished. As legal scholar Bernard Harcourt has discussed, however, the very category of the disorderly cannot be seen as that which exists prior to punishment, but that which emerges from the techniques of punishment themselves. For example, when young men are subject to stop and frisk, it is the punishment that gives rise to the category of the disorderly. While much of the work in the United States has focused on policing on the street due to Broken Window's focus on maintaining public order. Scholars drawing on Black feminist thought, for example, Joy James and Dorothy Roberts, have argued that a central site of order maintenance policing is in fact the home. For example, legal tools such as gang injunctions, as used in Los Angeles, in the context of a legal case against a gang that restricts the rights of an individual deemed by the city as a gang member within particular geographic zones, right? Or post-release supervision, in which parole officers stop by the home at any time during the day, make the home vulnerable to surveillance and raids. If order maintenance policing is premised on protecting the home from public disorder, these legal tools bring techniques of punishment home, subjecting households to forms of collective punishment via the targeting of a household member. Thus, a critique of policing sees such techniques of punishment as breaking homes and tearing families apart. This is really overlapping of, for example, as Dorothy Roberts shows, child protective services and mass incarceration, right? That is disordering the home. Yet, two further questions may be worth exploring with respect to these critiques of policing. First, if we start the story not with the event of home breaking as an inaugural moment, but rather start in the middle of the story, when multiple losses and small achievements of home are layered into arrest warrants, police controls, injuries, and threats, how does this change our description of policing? Is the violence of policing an aspect of the ordinary or an interruption of it? Second, if we do not take for granted the boundaries of the household or the domestic as a pristine space of privacy, then would our description of household and domestic necessarily require a description of the neighborhood milieu, right? In other words, how does the neighborhood emerge as a protagonist in the story of policing as it leaves its mark on households? Let me now return to Celia. And this is minor documents in the genealogy of N. Celia, I call out from the front gate. It is chained with a padlock. Orange and blue quilted blankets drape over clotheslines, shading the patio where Celia's boxer dog lies on her side. I call out a bit louder, Celia! I turn to leave when she opens the gate, yawning. Celia's 15-year-old son, Charlie, was hospitalized a few days ago. She had spent the night in his hospital room, arriving at 5 a.m. in the morning. I met Charlie briefly the week before. He was in a wheelchair in front of the house under the sparse shade of a young tree. Celia holds up a glass of water with a straw for him to sip. His older brother's toddler daughter bobbles back and forth from a small basket of toys set in front of the front patio gate to the wheelchair. She places stuffed animals on his lap, takes his hand, now limp, and places it on top of the toys. Okay. He tells his niece to bring him another toy. The shade is cool, but there's perspiration beading on his forehead. Celia blots his head with a thin cloth. See, you're getting better every day, she reassures him, but her jaw is tight. When Charlie had arrived home, Celia quit a janitorial job because he needed round-the-clock care. To help her earn income, her mother-in-law had lent her an industrial oven to make and sell empanadas and pan amasado. We sit in the patio gate next to the hulking oven, drinking coffee and chatting. As she relates to me Charlie's most recent hospitalization, her face slowly tightens to a grimace. I'm worried about my daughter. There are commentaries running that this one, she does not name him, who shot Charlie, will get out of prison and will be free. He's only going to complete 3 months and a half in prison. Oh, I say, as she lowers her voice, I'm gonna pass by the Fiscalia. This is the city regional public prosecutor, the Fiscalia, and make a complaint of a threat against my daughter. There are commentaries running that this one's grandmother is going around saying that this one is going to look for revenge. The grandmother came up to me and said that I should take care of my daughter. She speaks so quietly that the neighbor's sweeping broom partially covers her words. It's said that this one's brother has just gotten out of the penitentiary. She voices a circulating rumor that the brother had sexually assaulted a girl in the neighborhood, recording the assault. Celia remarks, "It would be good to find that evidence so that they can be detained. I have fear for my daughter. I am not here all day because of my son and my daughter, and my daughter has to go out to do homework with her friends, or she is in the house by herself." Two police officers arrived to Celia's house. Olive green uniforms with bulletproof vests, guns strapped to a belt on both the sides of their hips, with army boots and helmets. The younger of the two is carrying a big green binder. The older of the two taps the front gate with a billy club. "Allo!" he belts out, though we are seated in the patio right in front of them. Celia unlocks the gate. I find myself standing up. The younger one opens the binder to look up her particular case, a protection order due to the threat she had received from the family of this one, because she agreed to stand as a witness in the legal case against this one who had shot her son. He turns the binder around for Celia to sign her name on the document next to the date. As the younger one closes the binder, he looks quizzically at Celia's boxer dog. He holds his hand out to let the dog sniff him, asking, "And how is your son?" Celia begins to relate the illnesses leading up to the hospitalization, that he had developed septicemia from a urinary tract infection, and that the infection had started because he needs to use a catheter. He recovered from the septicemia, but he had previously developed a pressure sore on his lower back that has since become necrotic. The doctor, she emphasizes, had told her not to change the bandages herself, that a visiting nurse from the consultorio, the primary healthcare center, would come every day to change the bandages and check the wound. But the visiting nurse had not been coming, and the pressure sore became infected. And I just want to simply remark here that the reason why the visiting nurse, as well as social workers, don't come regularly is because they're not allowed to come after 10 a.m. in the morning because of the gunfire. The doctors had to debride the wound, which was now this big, making a circle of about 5 inches with their hands. The younger officer winces. The older one is stone-faced. When he notices movement in the house, Celia's daughter, his hands, which were resting on his hips, move to grab the handles of his guns. Celia says suddenly, "Have you heard anything about this one's release?" Jerking her head in the direction of this one's family's house. There's commentaries running that he will be released from prison soon. The younger officer looks at the older officer. The older officer shakes his head. "No, we have not heard anything. The brother has been released. But no, Johnny," he names him, "has not been released." Celia insists, "Where can I go to find out? Is there a way to find out if he's free in Gendarmeria, in the prison administration system?" The older officer shakes his head again. "No, there's no way to know that." Celia's voice is more emphatic as she tells them that the grandmother of this one had threatened her that her grandson, va vengarse con mi hija, that will seek revenge through my daughter. She repeats what she had said to me, that her daughter is home alone because she's with her son in the hospital. My older son does not live here. He lives with my mother in a different passageway. And I have the neighbor 2 houses down who sometimes can help me out. The older officer nods as if he has heard this before. Because they traffic, they can make these threats. Because with money, one buys everything, Celia says, now addressing the older officer. The back and forth with the police officer transfigures almost seamlessly to that of informing. The older officer asks, "She has a house on the beach?" "Yes," Celia says, "she has a house on the beach, but she also has many properties. The house on the beach is not in her name." The older officer asks, "Where is the house?" "I have a person looking into it." Celia responds, moving back to the topic of her daughter. "I have fear for my daughter." The younger one, officer, now finds a voice. "Where is your daughter studying?" She names the school. He nods, but seems to have nothing more to say. I venture, in this situation, is there a way to provide greater protection? We are only intermediaries between the people and the Ministerio Público, the public prosecutor's office. Gendarmeria is apart. These are different units. The younger one sounds helpless as he takes on a voice of the state. Celia gives him a long look. "Bueno, I'll talk to the fiscal, the public prosecutor. Bueno, nos vemos, we'll see each other." The younger one gives the dog a few pats on the head, and they turn around to leave. No sirve para nada. They're not good for anything. They don't do anything, Celia mutters. Todo corre con plata. Everything runs with money. With money, one buys everything. She goes inside the house and brings out a plastic shopping bag with documents. "Look at this. I filed this, and all I get are these controles." Like and she's using the word for medical checkup for the police control. The document is a parte de denuncia, a police report filed when a complaint is made to a local commissary. Information is entered into a standardized form. On the first page, the first box is a section on antecedents of the complaint, including, for example, which administrative region in Chile, which police institution, the name of the Fiscalia, the date, the number of the parte, the hour it's created, and the time the complaint was made. In this section, only the region, police institution, and time of complaint are logged. The number of the parte is marked as 0. The second section is antecedents of the crime, including the code for the crime, with the penal code, the date and hour of the crime, the medium that was used to commit the crime, and the type of arm or weapon, the place of occurrence, and the address of the occurrence. Here, the only information entered into the form is the date, hour, and the code for the crime. Those are simple crimes of simple threats against people and property. The third section, associated categories of the crime, is left blank. The last box is the identification of the complainant. And here, Celia's maternal and paternal names, her given name, her national identification number, and nationality are entered. Yet in the category of sex, masculine is entered, and in the category of education level, not defined, is entered. The second page of the form has boxes for identities of the accused, the victim, and witnesses, as well as for identities of expert witnesses and the classification of additional documentation. In the second page, only Celia's information is listed. The identification of the accused is marked only with NN, nomen nescio, literally, I do not know the name. Let me stop here before moving to the third page of the document to point out that the use of NN by police has a genealogy in the practices of disappearance during dictatorship in Latin America. We can trace the use of NN to the work of the Argentine forensic anthropology team, EAF, that applied the techniques of the excavation of remains to the investigation of human rights violations. In Argentina, state terror took the form of arrest, torture, and assassination of individuals in clandestine centers of detention, with the military burying bodies as NN in mass graves in municipal cemeteries, with no identification or publicity of the event of arrest or detention. Yet as historian Maria Soledad Catorcio shows, NN bore multiple lines of interpretation. During the transitional government in the early 1980s, and upon the discovery of mass graves, the military countered that those remains were NN because of their condition as nameless indigents, or that they were dead combatants who had been buried in this manner because of adulterated documents, or because their families had not claimed their dead out of fear. Within military practices, NN emerges in the chain of actions that disappear the living body through an association with being poor, or an association of the fear of policing, consigning the dead to namelessness. In the context of the mass exhumations conducted by the EAF, however, the discovery of the remains marked NN allowed for a public discourse of the, quote, concentration camps of living NN, of those who had survived the military state's work to disappear them. And it thus stands for practices to obliterate the singularity of the individual, her relations, and her history, while creating a public for these state practices to be witnessed amongst the living. In a similar scenario of disappearance in Chile, in the case of Patio 29 of the General Cemetery, those disappeared by the military regime were buried in a mass grave as NN, with some of those remains moved to other, as yet known, sites as the military sought to cover up its tracks. Alongside this mass disappearance, the military undertook summary trials and executions of the detained, returning remains to their families, while the Comité Pro Paz and later the Vicaría de la Solidaridad, in the first days of the golpe, resorted to the legal tool of the writ of habeas corpus to document the detention of individuals, first in the National Stadium and later in multiple other sites. Paired with a photograph of the detained, the writ of habeas corpus named the individual, placing her into kinship relations against what might become her eventual disappearance. Today, we can see the traces of these practices of disappearance honed under authoritarian rule in minor documents that register the poor's brush with the state. For example, on several occasions, men and women from El Hilo related to me scenes in which they or their relatives, upon being taken to the hospital with a gunshot injury, discovered the emergency intake papers bore no patient name. Instead, a piece of paper with NN El Hilo was laid on top of their injured bodies, even as family members who could have identified them were present in the waiting room. Only later were their legal names and national identification number taken down when required for the medical chart, for national insurance payments, and in the making of a legal case by the police. It is in seemingly evanescent minor documents that the individual as a singularity is disappeared into the state administrative unit of neighborhood. Let me now turn to the third page of the document to see how NN works alongside the police narrative within the document to place the police outside the neighborhood and thus outside the state's story of disorder. This page consists of the relación de los hechos, the details of the events. A full page, the narrative is typed in capital letters. In ex commune, with the date, presented Doña Celia, who stated the following: on X day, between X and X hours, I found myself in my domicile in the company of my son, who finds himself in a quadriplegic state, and along with my mother. My house is located on this address, and in this interim appears Petra R., who is of street, same comuna. She, with her sister, in an arrogant form, arrived to my domicile, threatening me that, quote, where they find me, they're going to, with what a large quantity of money they will pay, so that something is done to your son and your family. Moreover, they blame her of having drugs and firearms, which is not verídico or true, in agreement with what the complainant indicates. My son is in this state by fault of Petra, our son. They traffic drugs, including her and her sister sell drugs by the kilo. Today, we encountered each other in the Fiscalía de X, where they also threatened me. It is they who frequent in reiterated form my domicile and insult me, threatening my entire family. I fear for my family, since already the Carabineros are also in favor of them. From ex-commissary, she pointed out that there is an officer rank of this commissary that silences me, giving favor to this woman who is a trafficker. The car that frequented yesterday of the Carabineros is with this license plate. I request that this woman and her family be investigated. Alternating between two voices, that of the complainant, Celia, and the police officer taking the complaint, the parte shows neighborhood talk registered in these low-level bureaucratic forms. She, with her sister in an arrogant form, arrived to my domicile, threatened me that right, as well as the judgments from low-level officers who seem to have accrued some knowledge of the neighborhood. Moreover, they blame her of having drugs and firearms, which we know is not, which is not true, in agreement with what the complainant indicates, right? While also registering, but simultaneously distancing the institution of the police from the actions of the officer in a particular commissary through the switch to the woman's voice and her subjective experience. She pointed out that there is an officer that silences me, giving favor to this woman who is a trafficker. Such low-level bureaucratic documents could be understood as little tools of knowledge that work to lend authority and objectivity to the police through the creation of an archive. As Peter Becker describes in his work on the German criminal legal system in the 19th century, the standardization of procedures and the amassment of protocols ostensibly desubjectified the police, all the while making the legal dossier an excess of small details from which a judgment on the accused could be made. But how to understand these little tools of knowledge when basic demographic information of the complainant is erroneously entered, masculine, when there is no name for the accused, NN, when no number is assigned to the file? Are these the kinds of documents expelled before a legal dossier on a crime takes shape, right? So if you were to go to the Justice Center to actually get a random sample of cases, you would never find these documents. They would never make it into the legal case, right? They would never make it into a case. Here, NN functions in a network of other missing and erroneous information, no numbers, no addresses, the wrong gender, to create conditions in which cases are scuttled by the legal system, cast as merely neighborhood conflicts, or local internecine violence, even though the police are protagonists in these cases, and even though the practices of policing through surveillance, informing, the lodging of complaints at the local commissary lends the context itself a precarious quality, not only for me, the anthropologist, but also for those who live in the neighborhood. Let me now describe how the precariousness of context textures care when the domestic encompasses the prison. Okay. I saw him enter a door in the back of the house, only barely making out his shoulder and the back of his head. Till then and afterwards, I perceived his presence through material traces, a plate of food left on the table, coveralls hanging on the clothesline. Celia's husband, Manuel, had recently been released from prison, where he served 4 months for evading a nocturnal arrest sentence. He had managed to live without arrest for 4 years, but sitting in the plaza drunk from box wine, he was caught by the police. Once when I visited Celia, she was ironing and folding his laundry, noticing how meticulously she turned each shirt, expertly pressing the arm sleeves and then moving on to press the t-shirts. I ventured to ask how long they had been married. She said, 23 years. And how are things going with him? Is it difficult with Charlie? I asked. She said, look, we can argue, but it's not like before. Before Charlie was injured? No, before. How could I explain it to you? I endured golpes, beatings, physically and psychologically. She continued to press the laundry. In the first years of their marriage, she lived as an allegada. So this is an extended family member who comes and lives in a household, right? Allegada in the house of her mother-in-law and husband. It was so humiliating to see that for whatever thing, they would end up hitting me. After she and her husband were able to move, the beatings intensified. He broke her arm, fractured her skull. Her sons fought with their father, trying to defend their mother. Then 10 years ago, she attempted suicide by swallowing tranquilizers. Celia was living with her mother upon return to the neighborhood, but says that upon her return to the house, quote, he changed completely. Now we argue like a couple, but not like before. The suicide attempt seemingly realigned family relations, reviving Celia's relation to her mother, bringing in neighbors as witnesses to household affairs, and the state intervention through a protection order. But if this might be understood as a period of relative calm, the world would have a say too. Charlie was shot when Manuel was in prison. Celia made a prison visit to tell him the news. He was punching the walls. Manuel demanded that she visit every week to tell her how her son was doing. Her mother-in-law began to call her cell phone, reminding her to go to the prison, to go to the prison visit. She was waking up at 5 a.m. to walk to the bus stop that would take her directly to the prison because she did not have money to pay for a taxi. Manuel and her mother-in-law demanded that she buy prepaid phone cards so that he could call her to check in on their son's condition. When her husband returned home, he was overcome with rage at seeing Charlie's condition. Only the time that this happened, when Charlie getting shot, did he want to beat me again. And I grabbed a stick and I sent him to shit. And from there I said, never again, never again. I am not that dove that you trampled on and did what you want. Yet as she slowly divided the pile of shirts, this voice of defiance faded. These are for Gabriel, she said, putting a hand on one pile. The youngest son, whose name Celia rarely mentioned, Gabriel had severe cognitive disabilities and had recently been sent to live in a group home. As if she could not get herself to name her husband, Celia voiced the bitter compromises that she had to make upon his return. There are some who see these children as a cacho, a burden. Come winter, I want to start making homemade empanadas, sell them, because all of a sudden men can be very reproachful, sacao carita. What are you spending? And I don't like that because I give things that I've always fought so that I'm not lacking anything in this house. In the city center, I pick up a prescription of liquid tramadol, an opioid analgesic. Charlie is in pain from the atrophy of his muscles. With occasional help from her mother, Celia is barely shouldering the cost of medicine pressure sore cream and bandages and diapers, along with the money spent on public transport to and from the hospital every day. When I arrived to drop off the medication, Celia has just woken up. She had spent the night in the hospital again. The nurses don't care. They pass you a blanket and tell you that you can sleep on the floor. Her movements are slow and stiff, but she still invites me to sit down to share a cup of hot black Nescafe. Celia asked me if I'd heard that they killed a youth in this other passageway, que mató un joven en XX. She only names the victim and the act, not the one who killed. This is a common form of expression in El Hilo, a way to cloak knowledge in order to live with it. So the Spanish allows for this, like mataron un niño. So, okay. Yes, it seems that they were waiting outside his house to kill him with a stab directly to his heart. The kid was involved in the vice, el vicio, and metido en el vicio, the addiction to pasta base. The mom who lost her son, her older son died of lung cancer. He was in prison and the humidity grabbed his lungs. They let him out of prison when he had terminal cancer. It's her baby son who died. I don't understand. The kid was tranquilo, meaning that he didn't have any fights. As I am murmuring how terrible, Celia's eyes tear up. Me bajoneó esta noticias. This news gets me down. Like, que él sale a la libertad después de 3 meses y medio en la cana, that he gets out to freedom after 3 months and a half in prison. So she's actually talking about something else. Llevo tanto peso. I carry so much weight. I thought she might speak of this one again, but she begins to describe care for Charlie. And this is what she says. Waiting for the tribunal or court hearing, that they send me for a medical referral. Waiting for a doctor's appointment, that they send me here with the referral. I need to be with a psychologist with medication in order to be able to get more, to endure what is happening to me. But I cannot even take medication because I need to be awake with Charlie. This takes away your time, takes away your sleep. It's not your day-to-day life. I close one eye, open the other, because he calls me at night. Because what do you want? That I want water, mama. Mama, scratch my back. Turn me around. I am hot. Take me outside. That when he needs to be changed, I have to rinse him off. That endure it, aguante. That I have to be taking out his flesh. That be careful with the catheter so that it doesn't slip out. That it will not become infected. I have to see, put attention to everything. Everything. With each action she lists, it's heavier and heavier. But do you have some help, I ask? Now this all falls on me alone. Ahora, todo me. Before, at least I had the support of my son, Gabriel, who held the legs of his brother to get him into the wheelchair. But now all this, I carry myself sola, she stresses. I remark that it must be so difficult to lift Charlie to the wheelchair alone. She says, I asked the neighbors to respond. After when I have him changed, I asked for help from the neighbors to the neighbor who's a man. When that neighbor is out working and not there, I go to the X street and ask whichever person to help me put him in the wheelchair so that he is more comfortable, and such is life. But as accusations intensify between Celia and Petra, mother of this one, who shot Charlie, neighbors make excuses. Too busy, not home, taking care of a child, leaving to run an errand. Zoe is a neighbor who helps Celia, Piola, quietly. She and I lean against the wall, surrounding the patio of her house, watching the comings and goings of people on the street. She murmurs to me, there was a bingo for Charlie the other night, but not many people came. Take care of yourself, Carita. Her remark makes, I'm reminded of Martita's cryptic comment to a neighbor. To help Celia out with mounting costs of supplies for Charlie, Martita, whose son was killed by the police, and I had prepared and sold anticuchos, kebabs. Sitting in front of Martita's house with the barbecue going, a neighbor, Sol, and her sister approached us. Sol asked, why are you selling? Right, because there's always a reason to sell this. Don't just do it for yourself. Why are you selling? Martita responds, es a beneficio de, like it's in benefit of. ¿De quién? Of who? And Martita responds, la mano derecha no tiene que saber lo que hace la mano izquierda. The right hand does not need to know what the left hand does. Oh, says Sol. And she leaves it at that. Martita responds, we will continue to do this more often. Sol responds, that's a good idea. Her sister adds, though, It's good, but you need to know, kachar, because there are always people who take advantage. Okay, making it public. As Charlie comes home, accusations and threats reach a fever pitch. Celia and her mother confront the police officer, who is Petra's lover, calling him a sellout to narco. Petra arrives to the front of Celia's house, yelling insults. The police officer drives the armored vehicle Golpe to her street, sits outside with his fellow officers smirking and passing a gun between his hands. I'm quickly walking past Celia's house. She sees me from the patio and calls me over. I go over despite myself. Agitated, she says, I have to go to the commissary again. They haven't come, and I have a protection order. She shows me 2 more documents marked with different dates. Protection measure, police around 30 days. The most recent one was dated just a few days ago. Celia tells me that they are threatening and menacing her husband and eldest son, Ricky. With an off and on addiction to pasta base or base paste, Ricky had been arrested and charged for micro trafficking. He did not show up for a sentencing hearing, and since then has a warrant out for his arrest. With his girlfriend and their toddler daughter, he had been living with his maternal grandmother. After the police round started with his protection order, they moved to a distant neighborhood to avoid arrest. At that time, Celia cast the move as Ricky needing to become independent and to take responsibility as head of the household. But Ricky, his girlfriend and toddler daughter, would return to El Hilo because they both found jobs and had no one to take care of their daughter during the day. The return to El Hilo, however, meant navigating new dangers. The concept of owing time, debe tiempo, and being fugitive took on a very different significance when the context morphed into high-pitched threats and counter-threats, accusations and menace between neighbors and their kin. Celia says that the family of this one threatened that if Ricky is detained, they would kill him in prison, so he can't get to the point of being detained. But the grandmother of this one had informed on her son, Lo Sapio, like had said, okay, he's here, right? The carabineros arrived to Celia's house and her mother's house, not in the form of a police round to protect them, but with a warrant arrest for her son. Ricky had narrowly escaped and then had to flee El Hilo again with his girlfriend and daughter. I asked Celia, how is your husband enduring this? She responds, it's testing my husband's patience. Because they know that he can, and she makes a gesture with her hand, 2 fingers like a pistol. And my son as well. Do you understand? And my brother is about to get out of prison now. He wants to do payback. At this point, I notice the shift in her talk. Now, instead of naming Petra, the threats are coming from the more abstract category of the family, while Celia's husband has morphed into the lethal protector of the family rather than the aggressor within. She points to the TV that is on above the fridge. I want to go to the press. I don't know how to go to the press. I don't even have a computer to see the webpage of the channels where I can write what has happened to my son and that they come visit me here. Because I want what happens here to be public. My mom says that the only thing I can do is to make public all of these threats, that a family there is threatening decent, hardworking people who do not have a criminal record. So do you see how she's positioning herself, as the victim, right? And they only want to live peacefully. And the carabineros do nothing. We've had years of police intervention, and this still happens. Where's the protection from the police? Why are there so many guns in this sector? Why are there so many balaceras? That's what I'm saying. Make it public. Making it public. That is breaking this story out of its containment of the local, making it a story of police that is witnessed and not obliterated, as it is done through minor documents that place the police outside. I ask her, so will making it public give you protection? She replies, yes, because they all go to prison. They will all go to prison. I have someone watching over my daughter everywhere she goes. But in the school, 2 boys from that family are bothering her and threatening her. I say sparely, it seems that there's so much rancor. Celia interrupts, yes, they have rancor. Why? When this happened to my son, I put a complaint. 1. When they threatened my son, I put a complaint. 2. When they got to the point of threatening me, this time when my son was outside, I put a complaint. 3, right? When they threatened my daughter, I put a complaint. 4, And now when they give me a death threat, I put a complaint. That is 5 complaints. They think they are the only ones who can inform sapiar, right? So putting a complaint, sapiar, right? That we are adults, they denounce, they put a complaint, but no one puts a complaint on them. And because of that, I'll continue. For justice, I will continue. Celia pauses, as if momentarily remembering the pleasantries that knit together a surface of social life. She turns to me and says, smiling, "And how have you been, Clarita?" I find I can only say, "I'm doing well, thanks." We leave her house together. As we walk down the street, we see Chiara, another neighbor. She comes over and hooks her arm in mine. Celia says to Chiara, "I'm going to the commissary again with these documents. They are threatening me, she and her whole family." Chiara says, "Again?" Celia, "Yes, they threatened my son. They followed him with a pistol and he can't go to the police because he owes time." She repeats to Chiara the threats to her older son that she had just voiced to me. Chiara, calmly, quietly, looking down the street without looking at Celia, says, "How terrible." 2 women are in their patios listening in on the conversation. Celia raises her voice even louder. As we pass by, they stick their heads out of the gates to see who is talking, but they quickly withdraw into their houses. My heart is pounding. Chiara says to me, "Where are you heading?" pulling me further away from Celia's side. I tell her I'm heading down the street to meet Blondie. She says, "I'll accompany you." We take our leave of Celia, who heads again towards the commissary. Months pass. Celia and her daughter pass by the front gate of Martita's house as Martita and I are sitting in the storefront together. Celia is selling saccharin tablets door to door. She stops to chat, looking ebullient. "Clarita, ¿cómo estás? Tanto tiempo, it's been so long," right? She says with a warm smile. I unlock the gate to give her a big hug, remarking on how wonderful she looks with her new haircut. Celia looks at Martita and says, "It seems that you have a pained face." "Oh yes, it's going to be the birthday of your son." Martita says, "Yes, these dates are," Celia interrupts, "you just need to keep going forward. Tienes que tirarse para arriba. It's the only thing that we have." "Yes, mi hijita," says Martita with a hollow ring. Then suddenly, Celia begins to speak loudly again. I have to confront this one. I must have given her a look of confusion because she reminds me the death threat. I reply, "Oh, so you are continuing with the complaint?" "Yes, of course, they're still threatening me. The fiscal knows everything, that they threatened my daughter." Martita puts her arm on Celia, telling her, "Pase, come in," as if the gesture of stepping into the home would also take Celia's words out of circulation in the neighborhood and bring them home. I look out the gate to invite her daughter in too. Nicole is standing outside, leaning against the wall, looking down at the ground. When I motion to invite her in, she shakes her head, no. What opacities are created when injuries, pain, care are caught in a swirl of accusations and threats. It was seeing Nicole, now 13 years old, looking down, that I realized that throughout my time spent with Celia, that Nicole rarely ever spoke. When her mother gave voice to the rumors swirling around the neighborhood within the space of the house of the threats of sexual violence towards her, that they will revenge themselves with my daughter. It was as if Nicole was made into a sexual territory without having a voice in that sexuality. When Celia spoke of missing Gabriel, who helped her lift Charlie into the wheelchair, and that she now had to do this care alone, emphasizing alone, she eclipsed the care that Nicole did in the household, making the beds, washing the clothes, and simply spending time watching television with her older brother, now quadriplegic. Indeed, in the masculine, you might say, vocabularies of threat and counter threats, accusations and counter accusations that swirled in the neighborhood, the relationship of mother and sons seemed to be secured through policing and protecting the sexuality of the daughter. How did Nicole absorb this knowledge? What did this knowledge do to the relationship between siblings? For Nicole is not only the daughter of her mother, sexualized in this violence, but the sister of her brother. Perhaps then it is worth putting attention on this daughter's silence, not as an acceptance of how things are, of this state of affairs of policing, but as an estrangement from it. Could this estrangement also be, in time, a new opening for a different texture of care? And it is here that I think I must stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara, for being such a articulate examiner of this whole entire story and making it public, as it were. So we'll open this up to anybody with questions, and the folks who are online, you can submit your questions directly through the Q&A as well.
Well, Clara, thank you so much. I'm left a little speechless by that. I have to say, that was like I was watching a film of you know, but you know, the way I felt being almost in the home. It's a really powerful story that you just shared with us. I wanted to ask you something which is slightly different in relationship to the violence and this policing structures that you observed at the level of this one family and this one neighborhood. To what extent is that a reflection of the structural violence that was prevalent in Chile? You know, I don't know exactly the year that you did this ethnography, but and in the context of Chile's transformation in the last the following, you know, the fall of Pinochet. To what extent is this a historical, as much as a story of this particular family, but also a story of the history of Chile?
Oh, it's definitely a story of the history of Chile. I mean, and I think that one of the issues here, you know, that can be traced. So there's two issues. I mean, the way, obviously, under Pinochet, the ways in which, you know, the poor were cordoned off in certain ways to specific neighborhoods. You know, in fact, actually, the discourse of Pinochet, so much of the work on human rights violations in Chile has focused on, you know, the mass disappearance and political executions of political dissidents. But actually, Pinochet declared common delinquents as a cancer on the social body. And so, in fact, the military went around gathering up what they identified in areas, in specifically this neighborhood, actually, those who had like cuts on their faces because they would engage in like knife fights, round them up and actually tortured and killed them, put them in mass graves. So the common delinquent was also, you know, a victim of dictatorship, you know, as much as, you know, the kind of structural conditions that were put in place in terms of the profound, I mean, we know this, that the very profound inequality that was generated through structural adjustment policies under, I mean, this is the textbook case, right? The, you know, the shock doctrine and so forth. But, you know, that's why I actually bring up this genealogy of policing practice of the NN, to show that even as, you know, Chile celebrates itself as one of the most stable democracies in Latin America, there are practices of policing that bear the residues of authoritarian rule. And, you know, and that torture in fact does happen in democracy, you know, and forms of collective punishment do happen in democracies. And so, you know, so this is in fact actually also a story of you know, the history of Chile, kind of pushing it back against the success story, but also really trying to trace out, like, actually, how does this get anchored on the ground, right? So yes, this is a history of Chile through this family. I think that Arthur has.
Yes.
Yeah.
Arthur, if you can hear.
Yes, calling on me. First of all, I apologize for missing the beginning. It took me a long time to get back from the meeting. But what I've heard, most of the talk, this is the kind of incredibly rich ethnography that's close reading of lived experience based on intense listening and a kind of listening with care that's, I think, very different from non-ethnographic engagements. And so what do we have here? I think two things that I think are the contributions of anthropology. One is that in the 1995 World Mental Health Report, we emphasize the clustering of conditions of violence on the streets, in the families, toward women, suicide, depression, substance use, and poverty. And this is the story in Clara's first book, Life in Debt, I think a different area of Santiago. But this is a very good illustration of what I think anthropology brings, which is an extraordinary depth of social context, which I think is impossible to achieve simply with archives, which clinicians simply don't have the skill or the time to bring out. And I think it's radically important because in this instance, I would say the clustering of violence challenges the whole idea of the epidemiology of a psychiatric or mental health condition. And I think we see that here very much. On the policing side, I think it raises a very substantial question, which comes right out of the social suffering book that Margaret Locke Vina Das and I did, which is that the institutions created to assist social life can actually make things worse in the area of suffering. And I think what I want to press Clara on is the sort of jump to her conclusion about policing. We see the way that this erases the everything contextually significant and creates a case which is can be managed in bureaucratic terms. But what is the alternative to policing? Because there should be, it seems to me, in the light of a farmer-esque anthropology, a concern, and I'm sure it's Clara has it with. So what do you do with this? And to be of assistance, to improve care, et cetera. So what is the alternative to policing?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, this is a question that honestly, we are also addressing in Baltimore City. These are shared questions across places. And at least in my work and with my colleagues at Hopkins, what we've actually said is that, and what I would say here is that, the response with an armed police, is clearly going to fail and create very terrible outcomes, as we've seen, and that there are actually ways to, for example, there is in fact literature on this, that, for example, various crisis response teams that are not police-based in the sense of armed police, right, that actually can work and help in terms of mediating crisis. So for example, like, low-level social workers are very, very important here, actually. Community outreach workers are very important. Some of the issues that the difficulty that happens in these particular neighborhoods is because of the level of gunfire in these neighborhoods, they think that the state response is that there can only be a militarized response. And the way to kind of then also address some of these issues is to think about the fact that why is it that young people can get their hands on guns so easily, right? So there's multiple areas of work that have to be sustained in order to have an alternative approach to policing. But the core issue is to simply not already in some ways a priori
Mm.
take the neighborhood as a site of criminality.
Mhm.
Like, if that move could be made, like, and to recognize that people are dealing with a host of very difficult conditions, that there is in fact violence in homes, that the home is not an undifferentiated, indivisible unit, and people, sometimes women do need to call the police when they're being beaten, you know? But there have to be ways, particular responses that don't simply just then militarize that household, right? So I would actually say that there are, in fact, there is a pretty substantial literature on harm reduction literature
Mhm.
on forms of community policing that do not involve armed police, that involve social workers and a kind of trained mental health workers. But there's additional work that needs to be done around how is it that these kids get guns, right? What kind of opportunities these kids have, how to address domestic violence appropriately.
Mhm.
That all do need to be addressed actually in concert with each other and not independent from each other and not siloed off from each other, because the household doesn't silo in that way.
Right.
So yeah, that would be my response for now.
Mm.
Well, let me just push it a
Diana.
little further. Let me push it a little further because, you're not the only one who's worked on this subject. What about Helena Hansen's harm reduction approach? How would you, I know her work extremely well, and I know the harm reduction literature. How would you at all get started on that in a setting like this?
That's what I'm saying. It's not actually that. These things are not. So this is so just to give you example, it's not actually. I don't want to actually say, well, I can actually create a success story out of this. I mean, in the sense that, so even at the level of. So let me just back up. Even at the level of, the women in this neighborhood created a human rights organization in the name of, the death of Camilo, like the son, in order to address the issues of police brutality. And there was so much fear of being involved in this organization because as they knew that if they were to be involved, that the police dragnet would start to focus on them. And it's not just them, it's what they say, the filter, like their kin, those who are involved in money laundering, those who are involved in all forms of the black, kind of economies, illicit economies. So questions around harm reduction, if like they're kind of instrumental, they have to be very attentive to the specificity of the neighborhood. And the other, is that, women actually are already finding ways to mitigate, right? So for example, when Martita says, pase, like come in, and she opens the door and has Celia come inside such that her words don't spiral out and there's this intensification of talk, that is already a way of trying to make it such that, a violent event doesn't actually crystallize, right? So there's all of these practices, already within the social. I guess the question is whether or not those actually can be something that can be quote unquote operationalized, or if they're so embedded within the social, right? And that, to try to say, well, now because these are not like cognitive things that people are doing, right? So I'm actually, I would have to say, I don't quite know, in fact. Just to be totally honest, I don't know how I would be able to say, well, this is the pathway to improve the situation. If there's, there has to be multiple routes to that. And one is just to recognize what the women themselves are actually doing to constantly mitigate and repair relationships. And if that's been then asked to form the problem is if the state then says, well, now make an organization, those practices actually may not thrive within the state model. So it is a little bit complicated.
I have a question. Yeah.
That was just such a spectacular reading. Thank you so much. I'm Joy, a member of this department. I have a question from the feminist lens that you talked about, and is that the ending of the story of the young daughter being so silent is just really profound, I think, and I'm wondering if even that NA is preferentially used for men, when they're talking about combatants and everything, and are women even given that level of dignity? Is that used across genders? And that's one question about the gendering of even that as a distinction versus nothing at all. And then the other question I had, given this sort of recent political victory in Chile, and there's a lot of talk about sort of a feminist wave. I think the concern that so many feminists have in the global South and Black feminists is it middle class feminism, or is it a really pro-poor feminism? Are they looking at people like Martita? And that's, so those are my two questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yep, yeah, so the question, so the use of NN for the unidentified remains, that's used across gender. They don't know what these remains are.
Yeah, okay.
But it does raise the issue of the gendering of the combatant.
Yeah.
And who can be considered a militant. And when in society, the militant is the woman, it's not like there's a stable place for her as a militant, and let's say a mother, right? So those kinds of roles become posed against each other, and actually are very difficult for women to navigate. So that's one issue. But I would also say, though, that this question of that there is, it's interesting to see how this violence falls on the coordinates of gender and sexuality, where it is the policing of the sexuality of young women that ends up being. So that needs to, I need to kind of work on that further. I mean, I've seen this also in the talk I gave in March. This is also where what I've also seen. But in terms of the October 2019 uprising, the election of Boric and the feminist, working from the neighborhoods, the view is, so women will say, look, like all of this talk around, well, we should be going out and working, getting work outside of our homes, right? Like being able to be liberated and these kinds of things. It's like, it's actually like, a woman will say, I don't actually want to do that, because for me to work outside my home means working 3 different jobs.
Right.
Between picking up all these different kids, between putting out fires and different crises amongst my kinship network. Right. So, the Boric government, like they there's a kind of way in which I would have to say there's a little bit of an elitist, feminist elitist, kind of stance that, honestly is very disappointing. I mean, so profoundly disappointing, and also for the human rights lawyers who really expected a lot more with the Mapuche population, with the rights of the indigenous, and the violence that's continuing to happen in Araucania, the fact that people's livelihoods haven't actually really, they're just, so it's, in some ways, even though there's this whole grand narrative of Boric being elected and the 2019 uprising, the same mobilization that Boric, the administration could not actually counter in the context of the, of the vote on the new constitution, which was supposedly the most progressive constitution, right? That it couldn't counter the the profound discourse, the profound kind of, this just very severe anti-immigrant discourse of the Haitians, right, who are in Chile, and the reason why they went up to the US-Mexico border is because it was so horrible in Chile, right? And so anti-migrant discourse, right? And discourse on crime and security. Those were the two issues, right? The amplification of those issues, right, made it such that any kind of voting on this on the new constitution was going to fail. I mean, the administration didn't make any effort to stem that discussion and actually, in fact, played into the discourse of security, and saying, no, we need more policing. No, and the people on the ground, right, the low-level bureaucrats were saying, no, that's not what we need to be doing. Like in the municipalities, the low-level bureaucrats, right? These are the people that are, running the cultural offices. These are the people that are running the social work, extreme poverty. They're saying this is not what needs to be done, right? So, I have to say, it, now in the second issue of the writing, the writing of the Constitution, I mean, the cards are now stacked completely against. I mean, really, like completely against any meaningful change. And so that has further, with a really vitriolic discourse, continued discourse, anti-migrant discourse, and discourses around crime, especially narco. So it's like, well, the Haitians, the Brazilians, the Venezuelans, they all brought the narco. They are the ones, the Colombians, they brought the narco. They're the ones that are actually making Chile, the stable democracy, into this, kind of, much more unstable place. So, it's been a really difficult time for, those of us who actually have worked in low-income neighborhoods. Especially because those who consider themselves to be part of the left, if you will, have largely kind of, in some ways, given up a critical edge.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nikki Hernan-Tabibi. I'm a research fellow in the department. This was just such an extraordinary talk, and I especially found the sort of intergenerational workings of kin relations and care and harm really vividly portrayed, as you do in all your work. And I was really struck by this visual, right, that you have behind you here, and of course, it in part helped us sort of follow the storytelling and the interrelations between the people's stories you tell. But I wondered whether it also has analytical significance to you in itself, and also whether it's also part of how you approach this work methodologically, for example, working with genograms and so on in terms of tracing the care and harm across generations. And so I would just love to hear you talk more about that.
Actually, I feel quite ambivalent about the genealogical kinship charts. Not to say that they're not helpful to plot genealogy, but if you were to, that paired with the talk, the talk is basically saying that we cannot think genealogy this way.
Right.
So, because it's actually in all these small actions, all these, so, this is a way to, for example, what would I do? Like actually show who's in and out of the household, who is a member of the household, what are those modalities of the domestic? How do you show the prison visually? This is obviously not gonna do that work. So yeah, no, the work on kinship, thinking through kinship, these visuals are not, it's almost like this is a way to kind of help those who actually need to understand, well, what are these relations? But one of the kind of, obviously if I don't have this writing, then this is not what kinship is in some way, right? So, and and the question of like how, for example, Nicole, comes to learn kinship would not be, I mean, I kind of talk about this and seeing like a child,
Right.
right? And where I end, where I say, you know, she's also the sister of the brother, right? Is like, how does she come to know and learn kinship? Is not by actually having a chart or having these lines of, you know, relations set out in front of her, but is learning that daughter is this threat, daughter is sexualized, daughter is, you know, daughter is the angry mother, daughter is the sister, you know, like that brother is actually what maybe the daughter has to sacrifice herself. Like what does that do to color a relation? That is what is being learned.
And the daughter is someone who has not a voice,
And who does, yep,
who can't tell her own story.
Yep. exactly.
And, you know, I just remember, I mean, it spurred a number of thoughts. It spurred being in Aceh, in Indonesia during the time of the conflict, and hearing stories of what were called OTK, orang tidak kenal, those who, a person unknown. And it's a little like the NA,
It's different
but it's different
because
also.
it's the outsider
It's someone
that-
who comes from outside
that
and
creates
appears
habit.
at your door,
Mhm.
demands something from you,
Mm,
and you never know, OTK.
mhm.
It might be someone from GAM, from the military, it might be someone from the this,
Mm.
it might be someone from the police.
Real
It might actually be someone from, you know, someone just from the governor's office who's sent down to collect the monthly amount of money you have to pay to, et cetera. And by the way, sometimes the OTK comes and kills the president of the university.
Mm.
Right? And so these issues are like, so that, but it's a kind of ghostly figure.
Mm.
And it is a danger to know who it is, of course, also. So there's some overlaps, but it, you know, I thought of that, but I also thought of, you know, this work that Mary Jo and I did in Turkey, when one of the stories we told of this woman who simply, we would go in and she was identified as the person with epilepsy, and we would try to ask her, and immediately people would speak for her. And, you know, this whole process of, I mean, the way in which it's not, there's a lot of talk about stories, but it's also like, who's allowed to even author a story?
That's exactly it.
And I felt that very powerfully in this. I
Yeah.
would just say that to those of us here, like, my God, you've been doing this for so many years, this kind of like going and making those kind of relationships and getting to know this small number of families
Mhm.
at that unbelievable detail. And then living with that knowledge yourself.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, what could be done? And it's like, there's, in a way, this is an ethnography bearing witness.
Yeah.
Yet it does describe what the accumulation of everything from neoliberal policy, you know, from original politicization of any kind of forms of activism on the one hand, and then, you know, the accumulation of policing and all of the things you describe. And in a way, I mean, if we could give a nice story about what to do about it, that's not the story you have
Yeah.
to tell. The story you have to tell, and it's remarkable that you keep doing it, that you persist. Really, I
Yeah.
think, like, I don't know how the hell you do it.
I don't know, I just do it. I think it's like some of those things where it's like, when my dad was really, and was writing Sing Like a Child, I actually was thinking to myself, like, oh, this is what is keeping me alive. You know, what, even though it's like so painful, right? Like, this is actually what keeps me alive. So that's why I guess I keep doing it. And so that, you know, I guess this is what my commitment is then, you know?
Right?
Well, Clara, we're so grateful to you for coming here today, for so richly situating this suffering of this family and the community and forces us to think about all this context. So thank you for coming up here today and really thank you for.
So we're going to see you later at 6:30, right?
Yeah, and she has a little time now if you want to continue the conversation. We wrapped up